or it was an exception. You know, this is the main, and then women are the exception. And it struck me that, like, women aren't a sideshow. We're about half the population. The laws regulation of women is just as much the legal mainstream as the laws regulation of men. And anyway, I had this in mind, and there were a lot of examples, like when law professors talk about the most terrible or the most important books the Supreme Court has, decisions the Supreme Court has ever decided. It's always cases about men. There's no cases about women on those lists of good or bad. And then what really got me to write the book is the 250th anniversary of the United States is coming up in 2026. And in all previous anniversaries, women have literally had to claw their way in. Like Susan B. Anthony on the centennial, she, like wedding crashes, the ceremony to distribute some suffrage literature. Even in the bicentennial, Ford tells a story of America was founded through government by the consent of the governed, which is only a story about property of white men. And I thought, let me write this book before the 250th anniversary comes out, and to tell a story where women are just as central as men. And you might not have heard a lot about this anniversary, but I'll say that one of the first things the Trump administration did is they created a task force for the 2026 celebration, and guess who is chair of the task force? Donald Trump himself. And why is that? There's a lot of examples you'll see in the press. For instance, there's been a lot of headlines lately, but for instance, like just yesterday in the Washington Post, they rewrote the story of the Underground Railroad to take out slavery, which is hard. It's a hard story to tell, the Underground Railroad without slavery, because the Underground Railroad is about slavery. Yeah. But why is there so much, why has the Trump administration focused so much on rewriting the past? I think they're just an extreme manifestation of a very long story, which is there are so many struggles about how the past is told, because stories about the past are really about the present and the future. Like, among other things, my book tells the story of Donald Trump's long opposition to placing Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. One of the many, many consequences of Trump's re-election in 2024 is that Harriet Tubman is very unlikely to replace on the show. Anyway, so that's how I got the idea. And the basic kind of gist of the book is that I think forgetting about women is not only inaccurate, but it actually helps perpetuate women's inequality. I talk about two ways of forgetting about women. One is just leaving women out, and the other is forgetting that women have struggles still to come. So I think anyone in the modern era has heard someone announce or assume the sex is bad, all days are behind. But one thing I was very surprised to learn in writing this book is that you see that in textbooks even before the 19th Amendment. Like they're already saying women have achieved equality, men and women are legal equals. And it's not random. So for instance, when the Supreme Court announces that women have achieved equality, it's not random. It's in decisions where they're denying women rights. I don't know how many people would have read Dobbs. That's the decision overturning Roe and denying federal constitutional protection for abortion rights. But one of the moves Dobbs makes is it says it's not so bad to subject abortion to legislative control, deny constitutional protection, because there's no discrimination against unmarried pregnant women, the social safety net is so great, and also women have all this voting power. Now, all of those things are untrue. There's still a lot of discrimination against unmarried pregnant women, including by many anti-abortion advocates. Social safety net is terrible, especially now, but even then. And women do have, women do have the vote, but the court doesn't mention that, for instance, 85% of the men who passed the abortion ban at issue in that case were men. Of the legislators were men. But I think so. It's not true that women have achieved equality, but it's a very common move the court makes. Just at the moment they want to deny rights is when they say you haven't made, stop complaining. And I show that over a century, not only in court cases but also in journalism, newspaper articles, etc. But the book isn't just a bummer. It ends with a part called Hope, which is basically what I think is the unfinished women's rights agenda that is both teaching, commemoration, political representation, legislation, litigation. Do people have questions or particular things you want me to talk about, or I'll leave that? Yeah, go.
Talk more about your hope section.
My hope, okay.
Yeah, so what are some
sources of hope. Okay. Well, in general, I think one reason the book is a source of hope is because it shows that there are so many generations of women who face tremendous resistance and regression, and who kept going. Sometimes the only way through is up. So it's not like we're not in a feminist moment in American history, but there's been many anti-feminist moments before. You know, women are literally being shot at, dragged on the ground for asking for their vote in front of the White House, the very moment that President Wilson is reinstituting Jim Crow in the federal bureaucracy. Right. There's been a lot of hard moments that kept going. So I have a lot of ideas. Like, one idea I have is for teaching. The reason teaching is so fraught right now is precisely because it's so important. And I think especially K through 12 is really important. And obviously I can't go through every aspect of women's history in detail, but I think the key points to make are that I think we have a myth in America that equality's been achieved, but also that it was achieved through consensus. I talk in the book about this idea of like men's spontaneous enlightenment. If you've read a textbook, they often present the 19th Amendment as like a gift men gave women, which misleads on two ways. One, the 19th Amendment ends sex-based denials of the vote, but many women, especially women of color, are denied the vote after 1920. But also, the 19th Amendment wasn't a gift. It was a multi-generational bloody battle. Men gave women nothing. Women had to fight for it. But I think telling that story of consensus and it happened naturally and men just realized this was a good idea promotes complacency and just undermines mobilization. What do we have to fight for? Everything else came so easily. You know, America in its wisdom that's just not the way. It's not that America in its wisdom will do something. So I think that if we're teaching messages of conflict, of incompleteness, and that everything is in progress, it's in progress. Also that, and this sounds like a little thing, but actually would be a big transformation. You can't make a generalization about America that doesn't include women. You can't make a generalization about women that doesn't include all kinds of women. There's so many stories about America that are really just stories about men. Like telling a story of the founding that says the founding established government by the consent of the governed. That's not a story about any women or most men. It's not that it's not true about anyone, but that's just not a complete story of the founding. That leaves most Americans in the early years now. So that's one example. Yes.
So you mentioned that you started that back in law school, you started law office.
Yeah.
Did other women lawyers, because there were a lot of women lawyers who came through the system, did they say, where am I about this? And
Well, I think, yes. I mean, I think the problem hasn't been that with women not pointing it out, the problem has been resistance. I think one theme people often have, like say commemorations, there's so few statues of women, even if you look in the last few decades, and sometimes people have the assumption no one noticed, people take it for granted, it's inertia. It's just not true. The reason there's so few commemorations of women is because there's been so much opposition. So one example is Trump and others fighting Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill, but for instance, the Smithsonian Women's Museum, which has been in the news lately because Trump has a lot of ideas about it, it took more than 20 years to win approval for it. There was tons of opposition from conservative and anti-feminist lawmakers. Even now, Congress hasn't passed the statute to build it on the National Mall, so it has no home. And why is that? I mean, what the opponents basically said is women don't need their own history, they're already incorporated. But if you actually look, like the Smithsonian American History Museum, in its whole history has only done 2 exhibits on women. So the idea like that women are included, it's just, they think it's enough that women are in the background.
so still the question about the women lawyers.
Oh, I think there has been efforts, they just haven't been enough or successful enough. One story that anti-feminists told a lot in the turn of this century to the 21st is it's just a pipeline problem. And the world's going to change once there's been enough women who've been at the entry level and they work their way up. Now, women are like half the law students, half the med students, like almost half the MBAs, and it's not a pipeline problem. Women are missing from the top, even though they're plentiful at the bottom rungs. So I think even 30 years ago it was plausible to think, oh, it's kind of naturally as there's more women, but it just hasn't been. Because it's not just about presence, it's also about power. Yep.
So I just kind of wandered into this. I was here just grabbing a book and I had no idea what you were speaking on, but I'm a lawyer and a writer. And I went to law school, family lawyer.
I teach family law at UMass Law School.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you know Laura Thomas or Dean
Yeah,
Sanderson.
yeah.
My mother's also a lawyer who was living in the late 70s. I'm just curious, so it's the case of your last comment, do you think there's a specific problem, this is me not knowing what the issue is here, is that there's a lack of recognition at the very top in terms of like, the executive level? Is that, what specifically do you see as the problem?
Oh, I think women are left out of the story in almost every dominant arena where stories about America are told. So the book talks about court cases, but also commemorations. The press, the press has been announcing that women's equality has been achieved since before the 19th Amendment. Usually, and it's usually in the context of whatever women are asking for is too much. Women already have equality. Giving it to them actually might be discrimination against men. Like that, so it's that idea. But I don't think, I think it's tempting when you look at Donald Trump to think of him as a unique figure, and there are many aspects of him that are pretty special to him. But I actually think he is an extreme manifestation of many earlier trends in American history. So, for instance, his desire to whitewash the past, he is not unique in that at all. After Reconstruction, for instance, there's a huge rewriting of the Civil War. So I see Trump as like an extreme version, but very similar. I mean, he gives a lot of very unsubtle examples, like for instance, the Trump DOD isn't celebrating Women's History Month anymore. That's not a subtle example of erasing women, or they're taking down women's websites. Like B. Arthur apparently was agreeing, which is kind of cool. They took down the little webpage about her. Why are they doing that? Because they hate the Golden Girls. Everyone loves the Golden Girls. Because they want to tell a story about the modern. It's all about the present. All these commemoration fights they're not really about the past, they're about the present, right? They want to tell a story about the present in which white men are central, so they want to take out anything that's inconsistent. Or they want to, why doesn't Trump want Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill? He's given a lot of different explanations, among other things that she doesn't look like someone who belongs there. But, which could either be she doesn't look like someone who deserves that place of honor, he doesn't find her to be attractive, there's a lot of different. But it's not the America he wants to remember. Right? He wants to keep Andrew Jackson, who was enslaved. He declared himself.
So I have a brother at Columbia University teaching. He's in the education department. He was the provost and dean of education for a time. Now he's a professor emeritus there. And he's doing this project right now that he got a big grant for, of collecting American history of education, because you mentioned the commemoration. 250 years ago, education was a central focus of the founding fathers, of the community there, and he's doing the study for the 250th anniversary. And the first thing I said to him was, because the examples that he sent me as perspectives, which is about 13 pages long, were of all these male historians he's pulling in. And I said, so where are the ladies? He said, he sent a book called Female Genius to me about a woman in the 1700s who was going around and talking about women's empowerment in the colonies. And it's an extraordinary book, Female Genius. I recommend it to you, but I also want to connect some dots here, because what you're talking about is exactly going to what he's working on, and that is bringing in women's stories into our history of 250 years. So I want to just connect some dots.
And women are there, it's not hard.
No.
Women are actually, women are actually, I mean, one thing that's very striking, at least to me, is before the 1970s, you could say, well, are the historian, there's plenty of women's historians at this point. There's plenty of material to work from. I'll give you an example I talk about in the book. So, 1964 Civil Rights Act prohibits sex discrimination in employment. The dominant story to date is that there was the segregationist representative, Howard Smith from Virginia, who got the idea of adding sex discrimination to the employment discrimination prohibition on the idea this would be so ridiculous it would tank the statute, and he is a white supremacist, so that's what he wanted. And you see books repeat this. The Supreme Court actually just repeated it last year, this idea of like a poison pill. It is the case that Howard Smith, this arch segregationist, is the one who introduces the sex amendment. But what that story misses is that women had been lobbying him, including some women with white supremacist tendencies, saying, white women are going to be left out. And then, when he introduces it, there's only 11 women in the House at the time. 7 of them immediately are prepared with speeches. And they talk about sex discrimination as an actual problem rather than like a joke designed to tank the statute. Lately on Twitter and Blue Sky, whatever, I've been posting like little bits of feminist history every day. Just today, in 1964, the Republican Senate Minority Leader Eric Dirksen, this whole building named after him, he actually wasn't that great. What he did today was he tried to take the sex amendment out of Title VII. Women, including Margaret Chase Smith, who was running for president in 1964, which is kind of cool, mobilized. How can this story, so there's many women's historians who have told, at least pieces of this story, and much of it is actually really easy to find, like speeches people give on the House floor or in something called Congressional Record, which is literally the first thing you should look at if you're telling a legislative history. Yet, courts, scholars continue to tell the story as if only men are there, and I think it's just, they have an implicit presumption that men are the ones doing the action, so they're not suspicious of a story in which they only have male voices. Of course it's only male voices, that's obvious in 1964. When in fact, a little bit of investigation would have revealed, of course, women are very interested in their own legal status and are quite mobilized. I also talk about the unfinished legislative agenda, which includes the ERA. I know there's a lot of state ERA advocates here today. I guess I'll say 2 things about that. One, I think actually if you're looking for areas of hope, hello, June Carbone.
I want you all to know, I love this person, I love this book.
No. I don't think it's not, I didn't think for a second it was true.
But, by the book.
Thank you, June. Are you done now?
Yes.
You said your piece. I'll just finish what I was saying and then ask a question. I think a lot of opportunities are on the state level because it's easy to get caught up in the national headlines, but in terms of actual movement, there's a lot of opportunities.
So what I have been wanting to ask you is erasure. I mean, your book is about the erasure of women. We were there, altered history. And nobody noticed, or we noticed, and there was an effort to forget. Of course, equal rights. Of course, women got the vote because men finally decided it was a good idea. And of course, there are so many points of history where women were there in the backgrounds with great discoveries, but the men got the Nobel Prizes. Where are we now? And you may have already addressed that, but the erasure seems to me now conscious and deliberate, as opposed to inadvertent.
Yes, but I don't think actually it was ever inferred. I think that's actually a story we assume in the past that, they didn't know what, I think it was actually it was more deliberate. I think now it seems particularly blatant the DoD is not a subtle move. But I think actually one of the things my book shows is that putting the spotlight on men and not telling women's stories has actually long been a deliberate choice. I mean, going back to the centennial, where many accounts of the centennial ceremony don't mention that Susan B. Anthony stormed the program, which was obviously like one of the more exciting things. Otherwise, you're just listening to speeches in a 100-degree heat. But then, like, some women show up and storm, and that's interesting, right? And then a lot of the accounts don't include that.
Do you see women's place now, the role going forward as a standard, where they're in the streets beside the men?
Well, I think there's a lot. I'm not sure exactly what you're asking, but there's a lot of features. There's a lot of features of the Trump administration that affect everyone, like undermining the rule of law, disappearing people, going to prisons, etc. And I think actually there's been less attention on the anti-women aspects because there's so much going on, and like every day there's so many things. There's a lot of things. Like, for instance, they pulled most of the funding from maternal health. At one point, I think possibly still now, when you submitted grants, they were registering and blocking for further review any grant for scientific research that mentioned women or pregnancy, but not that mentioned men. I had a student who wanted to write a paper on this. I'm like, it's a little on the nose in terms of constitutional law. It's not like that exciting. Obviously, it's unconstitutional. So there has been quite a bit of targeting of women's bodies. And J.D. Vance, I think one of his main pushes is this idea that women make a mistake in leaving traditional families. There is a wing of the, not all of them, obviously Trump is multiply divorced, but there's a wing of the Trump coalition that is pushing against the availability of no-fault divorce in the states. We'll see. I'm not saying that's happening tomorrow, but there are efforts along those lines. And that is all of, women file most divorces. That is all about keeping women in the home.
Now, I have lots of questions, but I don't want to get in the way of your audience. So where are you in terms of inviting questions?
Well, I did a brief kind of overview spiel. I took some questions. A lot of different things.
Well, let me ask you a couple more. I mean, one of the questions as I came pouring in, still listening to the radio of the Supreme Court's most recent rulings, is the question of what is the role of the court in all this? So much of the book, I mean, the whole energy from the book comes from Dobbs, or at least your passion that I sense in talking to you about it changed after Dobbs. And are we in a lawless era? Is Dobbs an indication of lawlessness going forward? Dressed up, yeah, we're still in the ropes of power of courts of judicial decision making. But is it a sign of lawlessness? Not in order with what Trump is doing more generally?
Okay, so I started writing the book before Dobbs came out. I actually did not think the court was going to overrule Roe in one fell swoop. I thought, because typically what they do is, it's over 10 years. Like, Chief Justice Roberts and his concurrence in Dobbs, his approach is what I thought they were going to do. He was going to say, actually, 15 weeks is enough, and then the next case they'd say, 12 weeks is enough, and then, like, that's like how they do their job. I didn't think it was going to be one fell swoop. But Dobbs actually felt very familiar to me because that move of saying women have so much they don't need this is like a very classic century plus move. There are many aspects of Dobbs that I think, yes, that I find troubling and potentially lawless. So, for instance, the court's kind of like core argument in Dobbs is in deciding what liberty the 14th Amendment protects, we need to go back in time to 1868 and ask, what would the men behind the 14th Amendment in Congress and the state legislatures have thought? And if they wouldn't protect abortion, we won't now. So one problem with that is, obviously, no women are included. And the court just completely does not address that. But that's actually often a move I find that not only judges, but just journalists make. A lot of times they'll use people when actually it's just men, because they don't want to say men, because that raises the point that there's no women there. So that's one. But then the other problem with that is under their approach and win. And so the other thing Dobbs does is it just does everything it can to say we're relying on history, but then to obscure the actual history. So that's pretty well. They also cite as authorities the old common law bad boys like Matthew Hale, who's most famous for three things. One, rape accusations are easy for them to make, and we should assume they're false. Two, husbands have a complete right to rape their wives. And three, he presided over a witchcraft trial where two witches were executed. Spoiler, I don't think they were witches. Yeah, and so we'll
And the comments on women's status, the cavalier rejection of equal rights claim.
right. They also say at the same time, Dobbs simultaneously says, "Don't worry, women have it made already. They have so much power with voting. You don't have to worry about taking away constitutional protection." But then they also say, actually, we don't care what happens to women, or we don't know what will happen to them. It's too amorphous. We can only protect reliance for something concrete like a contract. So they're saying your ability to rely on a $20 contract being enforced is more important than something the law will recognize, whereas your ability to rely on being able to control your own body is not. Yeah, it's pretty disturbing.
It is. I found this, there were times I was reading this and I felt furious. And the gaslighting or the twisting of, and the number of women who also worked with, whether it was white women in the South, I felt shocked who said, because after she didn't win, to run for Congress 2 times, then she decided, well, I'm just gonna undo my this because I can't get through that way, so I'm gonna become a leader in anti-feminism.
Yeah, so Phyllis Schlafly looms pretty large in the book. She is this really interesting figure. She's a far-right activist, and as you said, she tries a lot of ways to get attention. She writes a book about defense policy. She criticizes, to do a modern example, the Panama Canal giveaway. She just can't break out. They're just not interested in hearing from this woman. She's a master's from Bradford. She's well educated, but they're not interested. But then she has this newsletter, and 5 years in, she comes up with this idea of ERA opposition, and it's a smash. Because the anti-ERA movement needs a woman in front. So I simultaneously want to acknowledge that women were divided on the ERA, but also to say, when you think about who actually voted against the ERA, it was overwhelmingly male state legislators. So there's a way that we remember ERA opposition as a female-led movement, but it really isn't. There are some prominent female activists. I mean, the publicity, Phyllis Schlafly is everything she says doesn't make sense, but she's a great debater at the moment, and she's very telegenic, etc. But she's not really the ERA opposition is overwhelmingly male. She's also important, though, in the book because I think she sets out the strategy that anti-feminists have followed for a half-century since. Her basic argument against the ERA is unnecessary because sex equality has already been achieved. There's no more discrimination against women. And the ERA would be a menace because it will unleash a parade of horribles. In the 70s and 80s, her main parade of horrible is it'll legalize same-sex marriage, housewives will get screwed in divorce. More recent opposition to the ERA, most of her parade of horribles happened anyway, so they can't do that. So their new one is new constitutional foundation for abortion rights. And one of the ironies is that usually anti-abortion activists aren't willing to acknowledge any connection between abortion rights and sex equality. But when they're fighting the ERA, all of a sudden they say, if you give constitutional protection against sex discrimination, that'll protect abortion rights. If the ERA's ratification is ever recognized as complete, something I can talk about, I have all those statements saved. And I'm looking forward to making an argument that the federal ERA protects robust abortion rights. Look at all these people in Congress telling us so.
Do you have a favorite character who you discovered in the course of doing this research who you think needs to be brought back into public consciousness?
I actually do have a favorite. So my personal favorite is a woman named Anne Davidow. The Bartenders Union was all male, they excluded women, except briefly during World War II out of desperation. And after, well, what can you do? And their big thing was they tried to get states to pass what they call anti-barmaid laws. So the idea was a bartender was a man, a barmaid was a woman. And they succeeded in many states, including in Michigan, which passes an anti-barmaid law in 1945. In larger cities, no woman could tend bar unless she was the wife or daughter of the male owner of the bar. Meaning, even if you as a woman owned the bar, you couldn't tend bar. Even if you own the bar and your daughter wants to work, you cannot. Ann Davidow was a pioneering lawyer, feminist lawyer in Detroit. She had put her brother through law school, and then to his credit, once he went to law school, he turned around and helped her go to law school. So it wasn't a one-way street, which it often was in these families. She represented these four women. It was a mother-daughter pair, bartender-owner, and daughter bartender, and then two other bartenders. Their odds of success were always very low, but she persisted. They litigated all the way to the Supreme Court. They get there in 1948 in this case called Gossip v. Cleary. In that year, the Supreme Court does not record oral arguments and also did not give you a set time when your case begins. Instead, the idea is we tell you what day, you sit there, and then hopefully you're called at some point. If not, you come back. So she's sitting there, this is the lunch break. After the lunch break, she reports the Solicitor General for the state of Michigan, i.e. the guy defending law, comes in with the justices. Like they've been chatting over lunch. It's so corrupt. It's so corrupt. The Solicitor General for Michigan gives a very short and sweet account, obviously has it in the bag. And then she goes up, and Felix Frankfurter, who's known as like this great liberal, heckles her from the bench while assuring her the days of chivalry aren't over. And either he doesn't recognize the irony, or he thinks, she's brought this suit, I don't need to treat her like a gentleman. Of course she loses, and the opinion, again, along my lines, it simultaneously says women have so much, and it treats women's claim with such contempt. To state whether women can be excluded is to answer the question. So I think Ann Davidow should be. She's awesome. I really like her grit. Oh, and I also like that typically when Felix Frankfurter is remembered, he's literally remembered as a genius. And I'm not saying he was a dope, but he's not particularly far-reaching as far as women are concerned. He also marries this brilliant woman and basically drives her, stomps the life out of her. Not literally, just metaphorically. So I want her to be remembered, and I also want this aspect of him to be remembered. One thing I found so often actually when I was writing these books is I would find someone saying something pretty sexist, and then I would look up their obituary, and the Times never featured this aspect of it. It was always they were famous, they did this, and I'm like, well, what about that article they wrote saying that women's bodies belong to the state? It never came up, So that aspect of it was never remembered.
And the point about that bartender one is the bartenders make more money. If the barmaids are out there getting grabbed and harassed, not behind the protection of a bar, it made no sense.
Yes, the bartenders would say in public, we're protecting women, but in fact, they were protecting themselves into higher wages because women could still be cocktail waitresses. If you just think about my knowledge of bars is mainly based on movies, but if I think about, I'd rather be in a bar with the proverbial baseball bat, to protect me than out. And actually many Life magazine interviewed some barmaids and asked them, and they said, yeah, I can't basically be out because I'm being grabbed by the customers. The safety of the bar is what I'm looking for. So it was all, it was to protect themselves.
One of the challenges we have right now with the Equal Rights Amendment in the state of Minnesota is there are those who want to erase history just to say, oh, this is the new ERA, we created it, and we don't want to talk about the past. And I put in actually a piece in the Star Tribune last week that said past, present, and future, very, very pointedly. Your whole book is about remembering the past and learning about the past so that we understand where we are today and where we need to go.
Yeah, I think the past gives you a lot of lessons. One is your time frame. This might sound depressing, but I just think it's true. Thinking you can achieve important victories for a year is just not realistic. Every important victory women have ever achieved has taken generations, including when it seemed, near hopeless. And with that said, I actually find that a source of hope in that it's not about what can we get Donald Trump to do in the next 3 weeks. It's about persisting despite and until and after. So I take that as a source of hope. But I also think another reason to learn from the past is because I think we need new ideas, but I also think there's already a lot of good ideas out there that just haven't been implemented. Like a lot of the legislative agenda I lay out, I'm not the first person to say we should have paid family leave. The problem is not coming up with the idea, it's doing it, right? Or people have been trying in Congress for 20 years to have a ban on employers being able to ask about pay history before deciding what pay to offer. We have a law in Minnesota, but there's no federal law. It's not a question, and there's a lot of studies suggesting that reduces gender and racial wage gaps. So a lot of it is, I think, it's not actually new ideas. It's maybe new strategies to get the old ideas, which are still good. They just haven't, we just haven't been able to get them through because of opposition.
Going back and rereading the history, are there points where you come away and say, oh, I knew about that. I thought of it as a women's issue. But going back and looking at it now, you think of it as it was connected to all these other issues we don't see as connected. And some of what I have in mind is also the story of witch men. So I used to teach an article 20 years ago or so about equal rights, and it was, I forget the title now, but all the blacks are men, all the women are white, and where do I fit in? For the people who are women and something else, or the intersectionality with sexual orientation, other sexual minorities.
I actually think that often when, for instance, courts tell the story of women's progress has been achieved through men's benign paternalism, that story often depends on erasing black women, or actually anyone who's not white. Like the Supreme Court in this 1973 case called Frontier has this history of women's rights where they don't really talk about women's activism, but they basically say we have these sex stereotypes because of men's romantic paternalism, and the idea is, race discrimination may be rooted in animus, but sex discrimination isn't. And there's a lot of things you could say about that, but one way they're able to tell that story is they talk about, in the past, they said, this is like literally a quote, they're like, neither blacks nor women, right? So clearly they're assuming women are white, and that's one way they're able to tell their romantic paternalism story. In fact, although I think there has been more vicious brutality directed at women of color, there's also been plenty directed at white women. So it's a myth throughout, but I think one way it works is by focusing on white women. Similarly, like when Phyllis Schlafly told the story of there's no discrimination against women, she would often juxtapose us with Russia, which at that point was not our friend. But she would say in Russia, women have to work in the fields, and in the U.S., we have women have clean jobs. Obviously, she's ignoring all the women farm workers in the United States, right? She has certain women, certain women.
Want to see the audience?
Yep.
What was the research process like? When you talk about a lot of historians wanted to erase these times.
That's a good question. I have 5,000-6,000 sources in the book. It took I worked on it for 5 years. It took a long time. One that I will give my husband credit, he said at the beginning, you have to just save digital copies because if we're printing everything out, we won't be able to live here. Which is a hoarder. That was very, very important. Actually, one of my tools that I'll just tell everyone because I really love it, newspapers.com, it has digitized a lot of newspapers, and it is a gold mine. So, for instance, I tell the story of this Supreme Court case that upheld a sex-specific statutory rape law, and I was able to look at hometown newspapers that are reporting in these small towns in California that without, it just would not be possible. I'd have to go to some public library in California, which I wouldn't even know would have it, and how would I search it, etc. So I ran the whole book through that, and a ton comes up. Just you see everyone's, you can track like every, I don't want to say character because it's real people, but like you can track their movements, and Davido giving a report, just an interview to some Detroit newspaper. So that was really, really helpful. Then I read every case on women the Supreme Court's ever decided. I mean, I put in the work, you know. The thing is, it's there, it's available. I will say though, that although I had taught sex discrimination for more than 2 decades, I found plenty of things I did not know. You know, I mean, that's another reason I think I find the book uplifting is like there's so many stories of women in the book that we should know, and we just don't. You know.
If you have an agenda for today, I mean, which injustices that affect women do you think are still invisible?
That's a big category.
Yes.
Like even, for instance, even within like bodily integrity, I think there's been a lot of focus, obviously, on abortion rights, which I think is completely justified. But for instance, 12 states still treat sex crimes more leniently when the crime's committed within a marriage. So that's an example of like, it's outrageous, and there's no newspaper articles on it. You know, so I just think there's so many things that are outrageous and they're not visible. Or there are things that are supposed to be taken care of but are not, like sex harassment is supposed to be illegal but is still pervasive. So, I mean, that's just the reality of the situation. Like, think of all the women testifying against sexual harassers who are so careful to smile, you know, and look personable. It breaks my heart, actually breaks my heart.
Today, we have 2/3 of tipped workers are women, 2/3 of seniors living on a fixed, below the poverty level are women. It's really easy to go through it. 2/3 of minimum wage workers are women. One of the most things you mentioned, rape, and less than 1% of rapists ever get adjudicated, or
Yeah.
you know, I mean, you look at that because 1 in 4 women will be sexually assaulted or raped in her lifetime. Those are the issues that motivate us.
There's a lot of issues where, and this kind of goes back to an earlier comment, but obviously right now we're in the middle of a big attack on Social Security that has a lot of gendered aspects, right? Women in particular are likely to, there's more, poverty.
Vast
elderly
majority is
people.
like 80% live on Social Security.
Right, and that, I haven't seen that reported. I mean, that's just not,
Yeah.
you never see that story. Some really good attack on teachers' unions, also female unions. You know, I mean, there's a gender aspect to that.
Oh, yes, I mean, so the difference between what teachers are paid versus workers with comparable credentials in other jobs is the highest it has ever been.
Yeah, I mean, in the 19th century, it used to be school teaching was a male job, and you can literally see in the 19th century school board saying, "We have to save money, let's put women's job."
The female teachers in 1960 made more than women in comparable jobs. Today, women school teachers make less than women in comparable jobs.
Yeah.
Substantially less.
I mean, among other things, I think the attack on education is an attack. I'm not saying it's only, but that is one of the aspects.
We also see where when women move into a profession, whether it's like, doctors, and the
Yeah, the
salary
salary goes, that's the, my understanding is that's actually one of the biggest predictors for salary declines.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why, I don't wanna say I'm a sympathizer with the bartenders union. When I understand them, they're right. They're right. The only way they were able to preserve their wages is by keeping women out. That's the reality. Like, they were also kind of pawns in the machine, you know? Similarly, I mean, the Trump administration doesn't talk about it, but many elite colleges have affirmative action for men because they know the status hit they would take if they got too female.
Yeah.
Women do better in high school basically, but they
Don't you think
can't.
that's illegal under the most recent Supreme Court decision, preference men?
We'll see. But I think it's the case that they don't want to go above like 52% because it's too stimulating.
Simple way of saying it is that patriarchy is affirmative action for men.
Yes, that's an alternative.
That's what I put in my writing.
Well, that is one of the things. I also have a book that's come out recently. And one of the things we found is the more corrupt the organization, the less diverse links. And just things like, your accounting reports get returned for errors.
Well, I've also noticed there have been a lot of very prominent female whistleblowers lately. Like just today, the woman we didn't want to let Mel Gibson get the guns back, worked in the Justice Department. She testified, and they had tried to send armed guards to her house to, I think, intimidate her, but theoretically give her a letter. There's been like the January 6th committee there was a lot of female whistleblowers.
Meta recently, with Meta.
Yeah, oh, right, the careless people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep,
Speaking of books, can you name any favorite books?
We the Men, How Forgetting Women's Struggles for
Sorry.
Sorry.
Like in
Sorry.
research for the book,
Sorry.
or just women's history or feminist theory in general.
Okay, so obviously my first four choices are We the Men, but actually in fiction, I recommend Rodham by Curtis and Phil, because that's a book featuring a female president. The premise is, what if Hillary had never married Bill? And in her reimagining, Hillary becomes president, but not Bill. And you might not agree with but I thought it was very interesting. I don't know if it's a personal favorite, but I do think it's an important book to read. Phyllis Schlafly's book, Power of the Positive Woman, has really had a lasting influence. I know. I'm not making anyone read anything. I'm just saying I think that is a very interesting book. Carrie Chapman Catt wrote this book, Women's Suffrage and Politics, which is about how they won the 19th Amendment, and it is an interesting book because it comes out in 1923, and they're already telling the story of men's spontaneous enlightenment, and men just gave it to them. And the review of the book in the New York Times actually chastised her for not taking. This is something like, you don't take your victory like a lady, and you're still basically angry at the men who oppose suffrage, and you should be moving on. This is the American practice or something.
Oh, I've heard that.
Yeah. So.
But there's some of the expectation is women are gonna play nice and wait, and not.
And they can wait because they'll get it anyway. Don't worry.
Yeah, but it's so frustrating because we don't.
It's never happened that way.
It's never
There's
happened.
nothing that's ever
And
happened
so
from
there's no
waiting.
idea of like, just play nice and smile and.
never happened. It's never happened.
No, you're not. And so it becomes, your head twists off because you think, I can't win here.
Yeah, I think one obstacle to sex equality movements is I think Americans actually pretty much recognize that racial justice movements involved a lot of conflict. I mean, there might be, obviously there's different ways of whitewashing that, but the idea that there was conflict is pretty clear. But I think we still have a dominant story that sex equality is a matter of consensus. Women's position is, women have the position in society they want. This has been achieved through consensus, so there's no need to rock the boat.
But what do you do with the men who feel they're losing? I mean, men are less likely to graduate from college. Straight men are less likely than gay men to graduate from college now. And gay men earn more than either women or straight men. And there's this whole claim of, it's men, especially men without college degrees, are the ones who have at least taken the biggest fall.
I guess I would say two things. One is I think there is this kind of bimodal thing where men are dominant at the top, and then there's also men at the bottom. Those two things are true. So men dominate the highest reaches of political life, corporate life, but there's also a lot of men left behind. The second thing I want to say is, I actually think that sex stereotypes are a trap for everyone, including men. So for instance, like a lot of those guys, not to generalize, but just become nurses. There's so many jobs out there, right, that you can't outsource, that you need some education, but you're not getting the education. It's possible, and it's sex stereotypes that are there in the box of sex stereotypes that are stopping them from going into these caring professions, which are growth industries, and waiting for some imagined job. And that's obviously that's like one of the things that Trump was playing into, like, I'm gonna create more male-coded jobs for men, even though realistically, I don't know if I'm gonna quote Bruce Springsteen, yes I am. Those jobs are going, boys, they're not coming back, right?
Yeah,
It doesn't
yeah,
matter.
yeah.
But whereas healthcare, teaching, those kind of jobs are growth industries. So I do think I think it is a trap for women. Right.
Yeah, I just heard a thing on NPR yesterday about artificial intelligence. There certainly is an argument that what we might call male stereotype jobs that were maybe labor oriented are going to be taken over by robots. I mean, but those jobs aren't coming back.
Right. So I mean, so
Amazon warehouses.
right. I mean, so to me, that suggests that like feminism really can be. It is. I think it is better for. It is better for everyone. I also, by the way, like I wouldn't call myself a member of the men's rights movement, but I agree with some points the men's rights movement makes. So, for instance, they want to expand the military registration to not only be men to. I think that's right. I don't think you can defend it constitutionally. So it's not. It's not. Even though it's called like We the Men, it's actually the book isn't designed to be like oppositional to men. I mean, every victory movement has had male allies. It's not. It's We the Men is just they're telling a story where they say it's We the People, but it actually is.
You mentioned something about women wanting to go in and be included on the registered draft, and they said no.
Yeah, actually, there was just a case filed on Thursday. There's been a number of cases, but there was just a case filed, and it's so interesting because
Wendy Murphy, yeah.
they're making two claims. One, they're making a claim that this violates the ERA. In other words, they're claiming the ERA has already been ratified. Good for them. And then they're also saying it violates legal protection principles in the Fifth Amendment. And it's a young woman who's trying to register for the draft. So we'll see what happens. The courts have not been very anxious to revisit this, and then Congress, of course, once the military eliminated combat positions in 2016, there was this question of, well, what about the mailing registration? They set up a blue ribbon commission, actually, testified for it, and then,
So women do want to register,
at least some of them. I mean, what I think is, it's not like I personally would, and I'm sure I would get killed in basic training because coordination is not my strength. But what I say in the book is that equal responsibilities and equal rights are inextricably intertwined. And the absence of one makes the other less likely. And in fact, one of the big mottos of the men's rights movement is no equal rights because there's no equal rights.
So Congress has always had the power to draft women to.
It could, yeah, of course.
They've always had that power, and they almost did it in World War II, and they changed their minds. They
Yeah.
didn't do it. But, I've always maintained it's a good idea, and that as long as there's a civil service component to it of working in the community and strengthening the communities in America.
Well, I don't think a draft is coming back anytime soon. But even
No,
during
but-
the draft, a majority of people weren't.
But the registration.
But that's what it's for.
Yeah,
It's
registration
registering for the draft.
registration is still required. Yeah, Eisenhower thought at the end of World War II, he said multiple times, the next time we have a total war, we're going to have to draft women.
Yeah.
It's
and
just
they
we
almost
haven't,
did it.
well, we haven't had a, good, that's good. We haven't had a total war, but,
So what do you think, so there's a movement now, both from the left and the right in different ways, to eliminate sex norm classifications. So you both have some trans activists who say, how can you have like different push-up requirements for police officers, for men and women, if gender is not binary. And you have the Trump administration eliminating the sex norms, at least for combat roles, saying whatever the standard is, it should be applied to everyone. What do you do with these kinds of arguments? How does that fit in this history?
That's interesting. Well, I was going to say something. First, I'll say something else. Then I'll say. I think one thing that's interesting to me is that we've had like 50 years of arguments which take as its start we have to preserve sex-segregated bathrooms, and I don't think sex-segregated bathrooms are just worth it. Like worth not having the ERA. Like it's just too much focus. Just have everyone bathroom. They won't have that as an argument. I don't actually know if the military ever had different sex norms. I think what they did, which I support, is they actually investigated. Do you in fact need to be able to carry this pound pack to do the job? And they found out actually you don't need. We had that idea, but this is what you need. That's what I support. Like, what does the job actually require? And then can you do it? And then if it requires something where it's very hard for a lot of people, is there a way to change? Like for instance, the military used to require people to run in boots and like people had all these injuries, especially women. And they realized, actually we can practice in sneakers. Right? That's what I mean. What is the rule? Does the rule actually make sense? If you actually have to do this to be able to do the job, I'm with the point that's everyone. But I want some scrutiny of, is this just a stereotype? Like for instance, police departments used to routinely require cops to be at least 6 foot tall, 6 feet tall. And obviously this eliminated virtually all women, which at the time, like that was, they didn't want, obviously they don't want women, it's fine. When they were sued, because that eliminated most female applicants, they weren't actually able to justify it. If you can show that a taller cop is better, fine. But in fact, it was a myth.
Or people who want to come into the discussion.
I have a question about religion. I don't remember anything about religion, but I think that religion plays a key role in women saying, I'm already saying all that religion tells me, and I don't want to do the lead in the family financial.
And I'm not telling anyone to do anything they don't want to do, right? If you want to stay home, you do whatever you want.
Right, but the religion often comes in as the reason in opposition. Oh, no, we can't have you do that. And I'm thinking, well, that's your religion. But they're saying it as in intelligence, in law that applies to all people.
Right. I mean, I'm fine. Everyone can organize their lives as they see fit. I support that. I don't support people imposing their religious beliefs on other people who don't have those religious beliefs. I'm not gonna. I guess I'll just say that.
But that is their motivation.
Often, like I think Phyllis Schlafly had a lot of religious motivations behind her opposition to the ERA.
And the role of religion in abortion, I mean, it's quite fascinating to look because if you go to, before Reagan, at least before the 80s, it was seen as a Catholic issue. And Protestant evangelicals, even like Catholics, were quite happy not to be politically active on the issue of abortion. The Southern Baptist Convention in 1972 had a moderately pro-choice position. That started to change during the Reagan years, in part because of the moral majority and the Catholic Church started becoming allies on a number of issues.
That's one of the geniuses of Phyllis Schlafly.
Yeah.
Is she figures out that you can use abortion opposition to unite what we know as the new right, which now seems obvious, but historically evangelicals and Catholics did go together. I mean, she's a genius.
But the shift you see is in the 90s, people who oppose abortion for religious reasons become more likely to become Republicans. But after 2000, people who embrace a conservative Republican identity become more likely to oppose abortion, even if they're not religious or belong to a church that doesn't oppose abortion. So that, and this is, I want to complicate the religion issue with what happens when political identity and the religious identity overlap and lock into a position opposed to waiting terms.
That's interesting.
Right, that's what I see.
Yeah, I think that is interesting. Right, abortion becomes, well, the other thing that obviously happens with politics is now we think of like Republican as all conservative and Democrat as liberal, but for many years they were as conservative and liberal wings of both parties, and they sort out. Like my book talks about some very liberal Republican feminists who over time leave the Republican Party, but it's like the Republican Party had a longer history of endorsing the ERA than the Democrats.
That's
They
right.
did
You know,
range
so I mean, and again, when you think about hope over time, party alignments switch over time, even sometimes with the same names. Like the Democrats and Republicans actually literally flip after the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So,
Same on with slavery.
right, so
Yeah.
things change, and then when you're in a certain year, it seems like that's the common sense, but it's not always how it is.
So I was standing next to a man at the rally, and Trump came up and he said, oh, there's no way a woman's gonna win first house.
Well, I mean, the book starts with Alice Paul, who was a more militant suffragist, and in the end of 2022, end of 1922, she predicts in 100 years what will America look like. She thinks by 2023 there'll be a woman president, half of Congress will be female, and then like the punchline that starts the book is none of what she predicted came true. In fact, there was this 2019 survey. Only a third of Americans thought their neighbors would accept a female president. I personally think that Kamala Harris, being a woman and not white, did cost her some votes. And even though she came pretty close, but
Darn close.
yeah, but that my own instinct is that probably cost her.
And Hillary was white.
Yeah, but and Trump I think was very obviously. I don't think this is like deep analysis. He used gender tropes against both.
Yeah, and in both cases, I mean, in Hillary's case, she was expected to win. A lot of people weren't comfortable saying they supported Trump in the polls. But also the people who changed their mind in, say, the last 6 weeks in both elections broke for Trump. And I suspect the reasons are different, but I don't think we have a complete answer on that.
We'll see.
I think more people have buyer's remorse now.
Yeah, I don't think he could have won on his current platform.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm not super familiar with like the legislative everything. I'm in tech, and corporate tech, and I focus on like algorithmic bias and that kind of stuff. And I'm wondering if
Your field is hot.
in your research, if you came across like thoughts or solutions on getting the information to the person.
What's your solutions on getting the information?
Yeah, like speaking to the erasure part, like getting the information out that we should be looking at.
And are you talking about the algorithmic bias that currently directs social media?
Social media, Google search filters, all media in general, news media.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's aspects of social media that intensify everything. They've done these studies where they have someone identify as a young man. Within like 4 days, he's being, like the alt-right is all over the suggestions for him, and I think that is very unfortunate. I think that's one reason, like, in terms of, for instance, teaching, I think it's really important not only to think about specialty classes in women's history, but the mainline classes. So I teach sex discrimination, for instance, but I think actually it's more important when I teach common law because I get everyone. So similarly, like in the college, I just think opportunities when you get everyone, even though it's not going to be perfect, but like the mainstream media could do a lot more to include women's perspectives. I remember this was like 1 or 2 years ago, the New York Times had some article on abortion rights, and they quoted 6 law professors, and they were all men. It was on abortion rights, and it it was just ridiculous, it's just ridiculous, right? Like, so just to make them more aware. I actually, this was like my most viral tweet, because obviously it hit a nerve, and I noticed that Adam Liptak now, he always quotes this woman, who I think should be thinking maybe.
Yeah.
But he had, even like in 2020, he had to have someone bring it to his attention.
Watch what happens in Europe. I think the current trade war is freeing Europe to regulate Tesla, Meta, Google much more aggressively than they might have done without it. And that's going to be an issue to look at.
Yeah.
There's water in the book.
Oh, and the water. Thank you. That's an idea.
We probably have time for one more question.
Anyone want to do the last question? Yeah.
You mentioned Alice Paul from early
Yeah.
20th century. Who are some women, aside from yourself and Betty, the wonderful people here, people speaking out and writing today on the topics of women's equality?
I like Michelle Goldberg of the New York Times. I think she's good. I've liked Gail Collins for a long time. I think she's funny, but also gets at it very nicely.
How about law professors? Michelle Goodwin at Georgetown,
Yeah.
and Melissa Murray, who and there's this podcast, Strict Scrutiny.
Yeah.
If you haven't seen it, it's
Very
very
straightforward and it's funny. Yeah.
it's both substantive and incredibly irreverent.
Yeah.
And they're reclaiming. I think the whole group is reclaiming a lot of the legal history you're talking about.
Yeah.
So Michelle Goodwin, for example, talks a lot about that with emancipation, it wasn't just about men. That freeing the enslaved women from, the sexual predators who owned them was part of that history. And she also does a ton on women in healthcare, on the mistreatment of imprisoned women, on poor women in maternal mortality, and that whole set of issues.
There's a woman named Dorothy Roberts who does basically racism in the child welfare system.
Yeah, there's an abolitionist movement in child welfare that parallels defund the police, but it's the child welfare system that I'm involved in a case in Kansas City right now. My daughter's neighbor took her child to the 4-month-old to the emergency room, and because the child, who was a large baby with a recent growth spurt, had what appeared to be some hairline fractures. They took the child away, launched an investigation. It's taken months to get the child back. It may bankrupt the family by the time they're done. They need to hire lawyers. And, the lawyers are saying to them, well, if you just agree that he did it, the husband, we can get the children back immediately. Ordinarily, this happens to low-income women without the ability to fight back. This is a middle-class woman with a 9-year-old daughter and no issues, and it's ridiculous. And in Kansas City, this particular hospital is known for being aggressive in reporting everything, even when there are possible alternative explanations. And in this case, I have a friend who works on these cases. She got the mother to get the x-rays, and she looked at them, and within 24 hours could say, oh, here are things going on with this child. These are unusual x-rays. The bone density is less than it would normally be. And they've now spent a fortune also on alternative tests and discovered there are some underlying conditions that might be concerning for the child's development. But in the meantime, both children were taken away. Their ability to see them is limited. This has traumatized the 9-year-old, who is more aware of what's going on. It's just, this is the system that we're running towards. Sorry, touches a raw nerve.
Anyway, thanks for coming.
Thank you.